The wire cutters gleamed in Karen's manicured hands as she snipped the last strand of ranch fencing. She'd terrorized the entire neighborhood for months, but today she'd crossed the wrong property line. Their heads lifted in unison, ears pricked forward, and something ancient and protective stirred in their dark eyes. Karen had no idea she was about to meet the most unlikely and most effective security system in the county. What happened? Next would become legend in their small Texas town. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling pastures of the Double Creek Ranch as Sarah Martinez stood on her back porch, coffee mug in hand, watching her beloved alpacas graze peacefully in the distance. The sight never failed to calm her nerves, even after the chaos of the past 6 months. The alpacas dwelled gentle as she spotted the familiar figure marching across the field that bordered her property. Even from a distance, Karen's platinum blonde hair caught the morning light like a beacon of entitlement. She wore her usual uniform of designer athleisure, her phone pressed to her ear as she gesticulated wildly with her free hand.
I don't
Care what the survey says? Karen's voice carried across the morning air, sharp and demanding. That fence is clearly on my property. I'm going to do something about it today. Sarah's heart sank. For months, Karen had been waging war against every neighbor within a 5-mile radius. She'd called code enforcement on the Hendersons for their unsightly chicken coop, and had the audacity to file a complaint against old Mr. Peterson for the offensive odor of his cattle operation cattle that had been grazing those fields for 30 years. But Karen's vendetta against Sarah ran deeper. It had started with a property dispute that wasn't even legitimate. Karen claimed the boundary fence between their properties was 6 inches into her land, despite multiple surveys proving otherwise. When Sarah refused to move the fence, despite the fact that Sarah only sold fiber from her animals at local craft fairs, the final straw had come last week when Karen had somehow convinced the county to send someone out to investigate whether Sarah's animals were being properly cared for. The inspector had taken one look at the pristine pastures, the spotless barn, and the clearly healthy alpacas, and declared it one of the finest small livestock operations he'd ever seen. Karen had been furious. Now, as Sarah watched her, neighbors stride purposefully toward the fence line. She felt a familiar knot of dread in her stomach. She set down her coffee and called out across the distance, "Karen, what are you doing?" Karen didn't even look up. Instead, she reached into her designer purse and pulled out something that made Sarah's blood run cold, a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. "Karen, stop!" Sarah yelled, breaking into a run across her yard. She looked up at Sarah with a smile that was equal parts triumph and malice. "Watch me," she said, and snipped the first wire. The sharp ping of the breaking wire seemed to echo across the entire ranch. Sarah's alpacas, who had been grazing peacefully 50 yards away, suddenly lifted their heads in unison. Their ears, usually floppy and relaxed, stood at attention. "Karen, that's destruction of property," Sarah panted as she reached the fence line. "I'm calling the sheriff." "Go ahead," Karen said, moving to the second wire. "I've got a lawyer, and I've got documentation that this fence is on my property. I'm just reclaiming what's mine." "You're lying." Sarah's voice cracked with frustration. "Well, I guess we'll let the courts decide that, won't we, after I'm done removing this eyesore." She snipped the second wire with a sharp, decisive motion. The fence section sagged slightly, but held. Karen moved to the third wire, her movements deliberate and calculated. Behind them, the alpacas began to move, not with the lazy, meandering gait they usually displayed, but with purpose. Their heads were high, their eyes alert. Sarah had raised alpacas long enough to recognize the signs. These weren't just curious animals investigating a disturbance. Most people didn't know that alpacas, despite their gentle appearance, were natural protectors. In South America, they'd been used for centuries to guard sheep flocks from predators. They were brave, intelligent, and fiercely protective of their territory and their human family. Sarah's alpacas had never had cause to demonstrate these instincts before until now. "Karen, please." Sarah tried one more time, her voice taking on a note of genuine concern. "You need to stop and leave. Now." But Karen was already through the third wire, and the fence section swayed dangerously. She looked at Sarah with pure contempt. "You know what your problem is, Sarah? You think you can just move out here and do whatever you want." And if you won't maintain those standards voluntarily, then I'll force you to. She positioned the wire cutters on the fourth and final wire. When I'm done here, I'm going to file a complaint with the county about your illegal fence. Then I'm going to sue you for every penny you've got. I'm going to buy it for a fraction of what you paid and turn it into something respectable. The pure venom in Karen's voice hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a fence. This was about destroying everything Sarah had built, everything she'd worked for, everything she'd poured her heart into after her world had fallen apart. "You're sick," Sarah whispered. "I'm a winner," Karen snapped back, "and you're about to learn what that means." It was like a starting gun. The alpacas, who had been approaching at a steady walk, suddenly broke into a full gallop. 12 animals, each weighing between 120 and 200 pounds, thundered across the pasture with the grace of dancers and the determination of warriors. Karen bent over. The fallen fence section finally looked up at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her face, flushed with triumph, suddenly went pale. "What the hell?" The lead alpaca, a magnificent chocolate-brown male named Spartacus, cleared the collapsed fence in a single fluid leap. He landed just 3 feet from Karen, his dark eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her stumble backward. "Sarah." Karen's voice had lost all its previous confidence. "Call them off." But Sarah was frozen, watching in amazement as the rest of the herd followed Spartacus's lead. One by one, they cleared the ruined fence with the grace of Olympic jumpers, forming a semicircle around Karen with military precision. These weren't the gentle, curious creatures that visitors to the ranch usually encountered. These were guardians, and they had identified a threat. Karen backed away from Spartacus, but found herself facing Princess, a white female with particularly intense dark eyes. "Stone, this is illegal," Karen shrieked, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." They simply stood there, 12 silent sentinels, creating an impenetrable wall of woolly intimidation. Every time Karen moved in one direction, the circle adjusted to block her path. When she tried to push past Princess, the alpaca simply sidestepped. To maintain the barrier, when she attempted to duck under Thunder's neck, he lowered his head and huffed a warning that sounded like a steam engine. "Let me go," Karen demanded, but her voice had risen to a panicked shriek. "You can't keep me prisoner." Sarah finally found her voice. "I'm not keeping you prisoner, Karen. My animals are just ... Her own voice. "Maybe you shouldn't have destroyed my fence." Karen's face turned red. "I'm going to sue you for everything you've got. False imprisonment, assault. I'll have these animals put down." At the mention of her beloved alpacas being put down, something cold and hard settled in Sarah's chest. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been patrolling Millbrook County for 23 years, and he'd seen just about everything. Domestic disputes, cattle rustling, the occasional meth lab hidden in someone's barn. But as he pulled up to the Double Creek ranch, emergency lights flashing, he had to admit this was a first. A perfectly coiffed woman in what looked like a $1,000 workout outfit was trapped in the middle of a pasture, surrounded by a dozen alpacas who looked like they were standing guard at Buckingham Palace. The woman he recognized her immediately as Karen Whitfield was pacing in a tight circle, her phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating wildly with her free hand. "Yes, I'm still here." Karen shrieked into the phone. "No, I haven't been attacked, but I've been imprisoned. These animals are holding me hostage." Sheriff Bradley parked his cruiser and stepped out, adjusting his hat against the morning sun. He'd received 3 calls in the past hour about Karen Whitfield, and none of them had been flattering. The first was from old Mr. Peterson, complaining that Karen had tried to serve him with some kind of cease and desist order about his cattle. The second was from the Hendersons, reporting that Karen had been taking photographs of their property from the road. The third call had been from Karen herself, screaming about attack animals and false imprisonment. Sarah Martinez approached from the direction of her house, and Bradley noticed she looked calmer than he'd ever seen her. Usually, when Karen was involved, Sarah appeared frazzled and upset. Today, she looked almost ... satisfied. "Morning, Sheriff," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Thank you for coming out." "Morning, Sarah. Mind explaining what's going on here?" Sarah gestured toward the collapsed fence section, where wire cutters lay abandoned in the grass. "Karen cut through my fence. When she did, my alpacas responded like they were trained to do." Bradley walked over to examine the fence. "For clean, Cuts through heavy-gauge wire, the kind that took serious effort and serious tools to break. The wire cutters were expensive, professional-grade equipment. This wasn't accidental damage. "Karen," he called out. "I need you to walk over here so we can talk." "I can't," Karen yelled back, her voice cracking with frustration. "They won't let me move." Bradley looked at the alpacas with professional interest. They weren't showing any signs of aggression. No bared teeth, no aggressive posturing. They were just ... there, blocking every avenue of escape with the patience of monks and the efficiency of a military unit. "Sarah," he said quietly, "can you call them off?" "Of course," Sarah replied, "but I want to make sure you've documented everything first. The fence damage, the wire cutters, Karen's trespassing." Bradley nodded, pulling out his phone to take photos. As he worked, he caught sight of Karen's face, and what he saw there surprised him. For the first time in the years he'd known her, Karen Whitfield looked genuinely afraid. "Boys and girls," Sarah called out to the alpacas, "come here." The response was immediate and impressive. All 12 alpacas turned away from Karen and trotted over to Sarah like well-trained dogs. Leaving Karen standing alone in the middle of the pasture, swaying slightly as if she couldn't quite believe she was free. Karen stumbled toward the fence, lying her designer shoes slipping on the uneven ground. Her perfectly styled hair was now matted with sweat, and her white athletic wear was stained with grass and dust. She looked like she'd been through a natural disaster. "Sheriff Bradley," she gasped. "I want to press charges. That woman used her animals to assault me." "Now hold on," Bradley said, his tone patient but firm. "Let's start from the beginning. What were you doing on Sarah's property?" Karen's face flushed red. "I wasn't on her property. I was on my property, removing a fence that was illegally placed on my land." Sarah stepped forward, pulling a folded document from her pocket. "Sheriff, this is the most recent survey, completed just 3 months ago. The fence is exactly where it's supposed to be, 6 inches inside my property line." Bradley took the document and studied it. He'd seen enough property surveys to know a legitimate one when he saw it. This was official, recent, and clear. The fence was definitively on Sarah's land. "Karen," he said, "do you have documentation supporting your claim?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I don't need documentation. It's obvious." "Ma'am, property disputes require legal documentation. What you've done here is destruction of property, trespassing, and possibly criminal mischief." "Criminal mischief." Karen's voice rose to a shriek. "I'm the victim here. She sixed her attack animals on me." "They're not attack animals," Sarah said quietly. "They're livestock guardian animals. They were protecting their territory from an intruder." Bradley nodded. He'd grown up on a ranch and knew the difference between aggressive animals and protective ones. "Karen, I'm going to need you to come with me. We need to sort this out properly. I'm not going anywhere with you." Karen backed away from the sheriff. "I'm calling my lawyer." "You're welcome to call your lawyer," Bradley said, his tone becoming more official. "But right now, I have evidence of property damage, and I need to determine if charges are going to be filed." Karen pulled out her phone and dialed frantically. "Richard, it's Karen. I need you to get down to the Double Creek Ranch immediately. I'm being harassed by the sheriff and that crazy woman with the attack llamas." "They're alpacas," Sarah corrected automatically. "I don't care what they are," Karen snapped. "Richard, just get down here." While Karen continued her phone conversation, Bradley walked over to examine the fence more closely. The cuts were clean and deliberate, made with significant force. This wasn't someone who'd accidentally damaged property. This was someone who'd come prepared to destroy it. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I'm going to need you to document the cost of repairs. This is going to be a formal complaint." Sarah nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. "Sheriff, can I ask you something?" "Sure. How many complaints have you received about Karen in the past year?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "I can't discuss other cases, but let's just say this isn't the first time I've been called out to deal with neighbor disputes involving Mrs. Whitfield, and how many of those complaints were legitimate." Bradley was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I've been doing this job for over 20 years. I've learned to recognize patterns." Before Sarah could respond, a silver Mercedes pulled up the gravel drive, kicking up dust as it came to an abrupt stop. A man in an expensive suit climbed out, looking irritated and hot despite the early morning hour. That's her lawyer, Sarah said. Richard Kellerman was one of those lawyers who made a living off of entitled people with too much money and too little sense. Bradley had dealt with him before, and the man had a reputation for taking cases that were more about harassment than justice. Sheriff Kellerman called out as he approached, "I understand you're harassing my client." "I'm conducting an investigation into property damage," Bradley replied evenly. "No harassment involved." Kellerman looked at the broken fence, the wire cutters, and Karen's disheveled appearance. His expression shifted from confident to calculating. "What exactly happened here?" he asked Karen. "I was removing an illegal fence, and she attacked me with her animals." Kellerman looked at Sarah's alpacas, who were now grazing peacefully nearby, looking about as threatening as a field of cotton balls. "Those animals, they held me prisoner for over an hour." "Mrs. Whitfield," Kellerman said carefully, "do you have any documentation that this fence was on your property?" Karen's face went red again. "I don't need documentation. It's obvious." Kellerman looked at the survey in Bradley's hands. "May I see that?" Bradley handed over the document. Kellerman studied it for several minutes, his expression growing more grim with each passing second. "Karen," he said finally, "this fence is clearly on Ms. Martinez's property. But there's no but. You destroyed someone else's property. On their land, while trespassing." The color drained from Karen's face. "Richard, you're supposed to be on my side. I'm supposed to keep you out of jail," Kellerman replied. "Right now, you're looking at criminal charges." Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat. "Mr. Kellerman, I need to know if your client is going to cooperate with this investigation." Kellerman looked at Karen, then at the evidence, then back at Karen. "She cooperates?" "I will not," Karen protested. "I'm the victim here." "Mrs. Whitfield," Bradley said, his patience finally wearing thin, "you have two choices. You can cooperate with this investigation, or I can arrest you right now for criminal mischief, trespassing, and destruction of property." Karen looked around desperately at her lawyer, at the broken fence, at the alpacas, who were watching her with what looked like mild interest. Finally, her gaze settled on Sarah, and for the first time, Sarah saw something in Karen's eyes that she'd never seen before: defeat. "Fine," Karen whispered. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know why you cut through Ms. Martinez's fence." Karen was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I wanted her to leave." "Why?" "Because ... Karen's voice cracked. "Because she doesn't belong here." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? I don't belong here." Karen looked up, and Sarah saw something ugly and raw in her expression. "You're not from here. You moved here from the city with your divorce money and your fancy ideas about farming. You did." The story of Karen Whitfield's arrest spread through Millbrook County like wildfire through dry grass. By noon, Sarah's phone was ringing nonstop with calls from neighbors she'd never met, reporters from the local newspaper, and even a television crew from Austin who'd gotten wind of the alpaca vigilante story. But it was the call from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Sarah, dear," the elderly woman's voice was shaking. "I think you should know Karen made bail 3 hours ago, and she's not taking this well." Sarah looked out her kitchen window at the alpacas, who were grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. "What do you mean?" "She's been driving around the neighborhood taking pictures of everyone's property. She stopped at my house and told me I should reconsider my loyalties if I know what's good for me." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Did she threaten you?" "Not directly. But Sarah, I've lived in this county for 40 years, and I've never seen her like this. She's different, desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things." After hanging up, Sarah tried to focus on the mundane tasks of ranch life. The alpacas, cleaning their shelter, checking the water systems, but every sound made her jump. Every car that drove past her gate made her heart race. She was in the barn pitching hay when she heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles. Her hands tightened on the pitchfork as she walked to the barn door and peered out. 3 black SUVs had pulled up to her gate, expensive vehicles with tinted windows and license plates she didn't recognize. As she watched, men in dark suits climbed out, their movements coordinated and professional. Sarah's mouth went dry. These weren't local law enforcement. These weren't reporters. These were the kind of people who got paid to solve problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. The lead man approached her gate and pressed the intercom button. His voice, it was calm, professional, and utterly terrifying in its politeness. "Ms. Martinez, my name is David Cross. I represent certain interests in this matter. We'd like to have a conversation." Sarah's hands were shaking as she pressed the intercom button. What kind of interests? The kind that prefer to resolve disputes privately, without the inconvenience of courts and media attention. "May we come in?" Sarah looked at her alpacas, who had stopped grazing and were staring at the vehicles with the same intensity they'd shown when Karen had cut the fence. Spartacus was already moving toward the gate, his head high and alert. "I don't think that's a good idea," Sarah said. "Ms. Martinez, I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't a request." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah's mind raced. She could call 911, but how long would it take for help? To arrive, she could run. But where? This was her home, her sanctuary, her life. Then she looked at Spartacus, who was now standing directly in front of the gate, and an idea began to form. "Actually," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I think you misunderstand the situation. You're not invited on my property, and my security system doesn't recognize your credentials." She could hear David Cross conferring with his men, their voices too low to make out the words. After a moment, he spoke again. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to give you one more chance to be reasonable. Open the gate." "No." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah held her breath, waiting for their response. What happened next was something David Cross and his professional problem solvers had never encountered in their careers. The gate began to open not because Sarah had activated it, but because someone on the other side had cut through the electronic lock with bolt cutters. As the gate swung wide, the men in suits stepped forward with the confidence of people who were used to getting their way through intimidation. They made it exactly 3 steps onto Sarah's property before they met the welcoming committee. 12 alpacas, moving in perfect formation, emerged from behind the barn like a woolly cavalry charge. But these weren't the gentle, curious animals that visitors usually encountered. These were the same guardians who had trapped Karen, and they recognized a threat when they saw one. "What the hell?" one of the men started to say. But his words were cut off as Spartacus planted himself directly in front of him, close enough that the man could feel the animal's breath on his face. The alpacas didn't attack. They didn't need to. They simply surrounded the intruders with the same methodical precision they'd used on Karen, cutting off every avenue of escape. "Ms. Martinez," David Cross called out, his professional composure cracking slightly, "call off your animals." "I'm sorry," Sarah called back, surprised by how calm she sounded. "But they don't take orders from people who threaten me." One of the men reached inside his jacket, but Princess, the white female, stepped closer and huffed a warning that sounded like a steam engine building pressure. The man's hand froze. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Sarah said. "They're very protective of their territory." "This is ridiculous," Cross snapped. "They're just farm animals, are they?" Sarah asked. "Because right now, they seem to be doing a pretty good job of protecting me from whatever you and your friends had planned." The standoff continued for several minutes. The men in suits stood perfectly still, surrounded by alpacas who watched them with the patience of statues and the intensity of laser beams. Every time one of the men tried to move, the circle tightened. Finally, David Cross pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "No, we can't proceed as planned. We're contained." Sarah couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could see Cross's face growing redder with each passing second. "I understand that," he said finally, "but unless you want this to become an even bigger media circus, we need to reassess our approach." He hung up and looked at Sarah with something that might have been respect. "Ms. Martinez, you've made your point. We'll withdraw for now, but this isn't over." "Yes, it is," Sarah said firmly, "and if you or anyone else sets foot on my property again without an invitation, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. And next time, I might not be able to control my security system." The alpacas maintained their formation until the men had backed all the way to the gate. Only then did they step aside, allowing the intruders to retreat to their vehicles. As the 3 SUVs drove away, Sarah collapsed against the barn wall, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The adrenaline that had kept her going drained away, leaving her shaking and exhausted. But she was alive, she was safe, and she was still on her land. Spartacus trotted over and nuzzled her shoulder, as if to say, "We've got your back." Sarah wrapped her arms around the big male's neck and buried her face in his wool. "Thank you," she whispered. "All of you, thank you." Her phone rang, and she answered without looking at the caller ID. "Sarah, it's Sheriff Bradley. I just got a very interesting call from the FBI." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "The FBI? Seems David Cross and his associates are persons of interest in a federal investigation into intimidation and extortion. They've been working for some very wealthy people who prefer to handle their problems outside the legal system." "Are you saying?" "I'm saying Karen Whitfield just made a very serious mistake. She hired criminals to threaten you, and now she's looking at federal charges." Sarah slumped against the barn wall. "How did you find out?" "Cross called his employer from your property. The FBI has been monitoring his communications for months. They recorded everything. So what happens now?" Now Karen's about to learn that there are some lines you don't cross, even when you have money and connections." After Bradley hung up, Sarah looked at her alpacas, who were once again grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. They'd gone from farm animals to guardians to the instruments of justice, all in the space of a few hours. But even as relief washed over her, Sarah knew this was far from over. Karen had revealed her true nature, and people like Karen didn't give up. Easily, they escalated. The question wasn't whether Karen would try again. The question was what she would do next, and whether Sarah and her unlikely guardians would be ready for it. As the sun began to set over the Double Creek Ranch, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for the next attack. She wasn't going to live in fear on her own land. It was time to go on the offensive. The war had begun, and Sarah Martinez was ready to fight. Sarah spent the evening on her computer, digging into public records with the determination of a detective and the fury of someone who'd been pushed too far. What she found made her blood boil and her resolve harden like steel. Karen Whitfield wasn't just a neighborhood bully, she was a predator with a pattern. Over the past 5 years, Karen had been involved in 17 different property disputes, all with the same outcome. Her opponents had eventually sold their land and moved away. She'd used a combination of harassment, frivolous lawsuits, and professional intimidation to drive families from their homes. The Hendersons weren't her first targets. They were just the latest in a long line of victims. But Sarah had something none of Karen's previous targets had. Possessed 12 woolly guardians who didn't care about money, lawyers, or intimidation. Tactics. The next morning, Sarah called Sheriff Bradley with a proposition that made him laugh out loud. "You want to do what?" "I want to set up a neighborhood watch meeting here, on my property." "Sarah, that's brilliant." "I know." Bradley was quiet for a moment. "You realize Karen will see this as a direct challenge." "Good. I'm tired of being on defense. It's time to show this community that bullies can be beaten, and you think your alpacas will protect a whole crowd of people." Sarah looked out at her herd, who were going about their morning routine with the calm efficiency of a well-oiled machine. "Sheriff, I think my alpacas are about to become local celebrities." The news of the neighborhood watch meeting spread faster than Sarah had expected. Within hours, her phone was ringing with calls from people she'd never met. Farmers, ranchers, retirees, young families all, with stories about Karen's harassment. By evening, 43 people had committed to attending. But it was the call from Maria Santos that made Sarah's heart race with excitement. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Maria Santos. I'm a producer with Channel 6 News in Austin. We'd like to cover your neighborhood watch meeting." "I don't know if that's a good idea, ma'am. We've been following the Karen Whitfield story since yesterday. This isn't just local news anymore. The FBI investigation, the intimidation tactics, the alpaca security system. This is going national." Sarah's mind raced. National attention meant pressure, scrutiny, and potentially more danger. But it also meant accountability. Karen Whitfield thrived in the shadows, intimidating people one at a time. She wilted under public scrutiny. "When do you want to film?" Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for what Sarah privately thought of as her declaration of war. She'd spent the week preparing her property for visitors, setting up chairs in the pasture, and installing a small stage near the barn. The alpacas seemed to sense that something important was happening. They'd positioned themselves strategically around the property, like sentries preparing for battle. The first arrivals came early. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, carrying a casserole dish and wearing expressions of nervous determination. "Sarah," Mrs. Henderson said, "we can't thank you enough for doing this." "Don't thank me yet," Sarah replied. "We don't know how this is going to end." By 10 o'clock, the pasture was full of people. Families with children, elderly couples, young professionals who'd moved to the area for the peaceful lifestyle. All of them had stories about Karen's harassment, and all of them were tired of living in fear. The news crew arrived at 10:15, followed immediately by Sheriff Bradley and 2 FBI agents who'd driven down from Austin. Sarah hadn't expected federal law enforcement, but she wasn't complaining. At exactly 10:30, as Sarah was preparing to start the meeting, a convoy of vehicles appeared at the gate. Karen's silver Mercedes led the procession, followed by Richard Kellerman's BMW and 3 other cars Sarah didn't recognize. "Here we go," Sheriff Bradley muttered. Karen climbed out of her Mercedes wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. She looked like she was dressed for a hostile corporate takeover, which Sarah realized was probably exactly how she viewed this situation. Behind her came Kellerman and what appeared to be a small army of lawyers, all carrying briefcases and looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Ms. Martinez," Karen called out as she approached the gate, "I demand you stop this illegal assembly immediately." Sarah walked to the gate, flanked by Spartacus and Princess, who'd appointed themselves her personal bodyguards. "Good morning, Karen. This is a private meeting on private property. You're not invited. This is harassment." Karen's voice carried across the pasture, and Sarah noticed that several of her neighbors were recording the confrontation on their phones. "I'm going to have every one of these people arrested for conspiracy." "Conspiracy to what?" Sheriff Bradley asked, stepping up beside Sarah. "Exercise their First Amendment rights." Karen's face turned red. "Sheriff, these people are plotting against me." "Actually," said Agent Jennifer Walsh, one of the FBI agents, "we're more interested in your plotting, Mrs. Whitfield." Karen went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about, David Cross and his associates. The phone calls we recorded. The federal crimes you've committed by hiring criminals to intimidate witnesses in an ongoing investigation." Sarah watched Karen's face cycle through emotions: fear, rage, calculation, and finally, desperate defiance. "I want my lawyer," Karen said. "You've got 5 of them right here," Agent Walsh replied, "but they can't help you with federal charges." The news camera was capturing everything, and Sarah could see Maria Santos conducting interviews with neighbors. In the background, this was exactly what Karen had tried to prevent: public scrutiny, media attention, accountability. But Karen wasn't finished. She never was. "Fine," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than her earlier shouting. "You want to play games? Let's play games." She pulled out her phone and made a call. "Yes, it's me. I want you to file the paperwork immediately. All of it." Sarah felt a chill of dread. "What? Paperwork?" Karen smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Sarah had ever seen. "The county has very strict regulations about livestock operations, Ms. Martinez. Regulations about proper permits, environmental impact studies, neighbor notifications." Sarah's heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your little alpaca operation has been illegal from day one. I'm talking about the health department citations I'm about to file. I'm talking about the animal welfare complaints that are going to result in your precious animals being confiscated." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. She'd been so focused on defending her property that she'd never considered this angle of attack. "You can't do that," she whispered. "Watch me," Karen replied. "By this time next week, your animals will be gone, your permits will be revoked, and you'll be facing fines that will force you to sell this property to pay them off." Agent Walsh stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitfield, filing false complaints is a federal crime. Who says they're false?" Karen's smile widened. "I've had environmental experts document every violation, health inspectors ready to testify, veterinarians prepared to swear that these animals are a public safety hazard." Sarah's legs felt weak. "You've been planning this for months. See, Sarah, you think this is about property lines and neighborhood disputes, but this is business. And in business, You use every weapon at your disposal. Karen turned to address the crowd in the pasture. All of you need to understand something. Ms. Martinez is about to lose everything. Her animals, her property, her livelihood. And if any of you continue to associate with her, you'll find yourselves facing similar scrutiny. The threat was clear, and Sarah watched several of her neighbors exchange nervous glances. Karen was playing her trump card, the one weapon Sarah hadn't anticipated. But as Sarah stood there, feeling defeated and overwhelmed, she felt a gentle nudge against her shoulder. Spartacus was pressing against her, and as she looked into his dark, intelligent eyes, she saw something that gave her strength. These animals trusted her. They'd protected her. They'd stood by her when human allies had failed, and they weren't going anywhere without a fight. Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked Karen directly in the eye. You're right about one thing, Karen. This is business. But you made one critical mistake. What's that? You threatened my family. Sarah gestured to the alpacas, who had somehow formed a line between her and Karen, as if they understood exactly what was happening. These animals aren't just livestock to me. They're not just a business operation. They're my family, and people will do extraordinary things to protect their families. Karen's confident smile faltered slightly. So bring your lawyers, your inspectors, your bureaucrats, file your complaints, your citations, your bogus health violations. Do whatever you think you need to do. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. Because I'm going to fight you every step of the way. And I'm not fighting alone. She looked at the crowd of neighbors in her pasture, at the news cameras recording everything, at the FBI agents taking notes. You want to know the difference. Between you and me, Karen, you fight dirty because you have to. I fight clean because I can. The challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down on a battlefield. Karen's smile returned, but it looked forced now, brittle around the edges. We'll see about that, Ms. Martinez. We'll see about that. The first blow came on Monday morning in the form of 3 official vehicles pulling up to Sarah's gates simultaneously: the county health department, animal control, and environmental services. Each carried clipboards thick with complaints, citations, and inspection orders, all filed by Karen Whitfield and her network of hired experts. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Inspector Janet Crowley from the health department climbed out of her truck, her face grim with the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Behind her, Animal Control Officer Mike Rodriguez looked equally uncomfortable, while Environmental Inspector Tom Walshno, relation to the FBI agents, seemed genuinely confused about why he was there. Ms. Martinez, Inspector Crowley called out over the intercom, "We need to conduct an inspection of your livestock operation." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. Of course, let me get the gate. What happened next was something none of the inspectors had expected. As the gate opened and they stepped onto the property, they were greeted by what looked like a reception committee. The alpacas had arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle near the entrance, not blocking the inspector's path, but clearly observing them with intense curiosity. "Those are some well-behaved animals," Officer Rodriguez commented, pulling out his clipboard. "Usually livestock scatter when strangers arrive." "They're protective," Sarah explained, walking over to join the group. "But they're gentle with people who aren't threatening them." Inspector Crowley looked around the property with professional eyes, taking in the pristine pastures, the spotless barn, the carefully maintained fencing. "Ms. Martinez, I have to be honest with you. The complaints we received painted a very different picture of this operation." "What kind of picture?" "Unsanitary conditions? Overcrowding animals in distress?" Crowley gestured at the alpacas, who were grazing peacefully nearby. "This doesn't match the descriptions we were given." Sarah felt a flutter of hope. "Would you like a tour?" What followed was the most thorough inspection Sarah's ranch had ever received. The 3 officials examined every inch of the property wall: systems, feed storage, shelter conditions, pasture management. They tested soil samples, photographed animal conditions, and documented everything with meticulous care. The alpacas, meanwhile, seemed to understand that these visitors were different. From Karen's hired Intimidators, they followed the inspectors around like curious tour guides, occasionally nuzzling hands or posing for photographs. Ms. Martinez, Inspector Walsh, said after 2 hours of examination, "I'm supposed to cite you for environmental violations, but I can't find any. Your pasture management is exemplary. Your waste disposal system is better than most commercial operations I've seen." Officer Rodriguez was equally baffled. "I'm looking for signs of animal neglect or cruelty, but these are some of the healthiest, happiest livestock I've ever encountered. They're clearly well cared for and properly socialized." "And the health department complaints?" Sarah asked. Afraid to hope, Inspector Crowley shook her head. "Completely unfounded. Your operation meets or exceeds every health and safety standard we have. Whoever filed these complaints was either misinformed or deliberately filing false reports." Sarah felt weak with relief, but she knew this was just the beginning. "There will be more complaints, won't there?" "Probably," Crowley admitted. "But now we have documentation of the actual conditions here. If someone keeps filing false reports, that becomes a legal issue." After the inspectors left, Sarah called Sheriff Bradley with the good news. His response surprised her. "Sarah, you need to see something. Can you come down to the station?" 30 minutes later, Sarah sat in Bradley's office staring at a stack of legal documents that made her head spin. "Karen's filed 17 different complaints against you with 5 different agencies," Bradley explained. "Health Department, Environmental Services, Animal Control, the County Clerk, and the State Agriculture Department, 17. She's claiming everything from environmental contamination to operating an illegal business to harboring dangerous animals. She's also filed a civil lawsuit claiming your alpacas are a public nuisance that's affecting her property values." Sarah slumped in her chair. "How is that even legal?" "It's not," said a new voice from the doorway. Sarah turned to see a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms. "But it's effective." Bradley stood up. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet District Attorney Catherine Ross." Sarah shook the woman's hand, confused. "Why is the district attorney interested in a neighbor dispute?" "Because it's not a neighbor dispute anymore," Ross replied, taking a seat. "It's a pattern of criminal behavior. Karen Whitfield has been using the legal system as a weapon for years, and we're finally in a position to stop her." Ross opened a folder and spread photos across Bradley's desk. "These are the 17 families that Karen has driven out of the county over the past 5 years. She uses the same playbook every time: harassment, frivolous lawsuits, false complaints, and professional intimidation." Sarah stared at the photos. Families with children, elderly couples, young professionals. All of them had been forced to abandon their homes and dreams because of one woman's greed and malice. Why hasn't anyone stopped her before? Because she's been careful. She always stays just inside the letter of the law. She files complaints that are technically legal, even if they're baseless. She hires lawyers who know how to work the system. And most importantly, her victims always gave up before it went to trial. Ross leaned forward. "But you didn't give up, and that changes everything. I don't understand." Karen made a mistake when she hired David Cross and his people. Federal crimes leave federal evidence. The FBI has been building a case against her 4 months, and your situation gave them the probable cause they needed for a full investigation. Bradley pulled out another folder. They've been monitoring her communications, her financial records, her network of associates. What they found is enough to bring down not just Karen, but her entire operation. Sarah felt dizzy. Operation Karen Whitfield isn't just a neighborhood bully, Ross explained. She's the front for a real estate development company that specializes in forced acquisitions. They identify desirable properties, research the owners for vulnerabilities, then systematically harass them until they sell for below-market prices. The company then flips the properties to developers for massive profits. It's completely legal, as long as they don't cross certain lines. But hiring criminals to intimidate witnesses crossed those lines, Bradley added. Sarah stared at the documents, trying to process what she was hearing. "So this was never about me personally." "Oh, it became personal," Ross said grimly. "Karen's not used to losing. When you fought back, when your alpacas made her look ridiculous, when the media got involved, that damaged her reputation and her business model. What happens now?" "Now we go to war," Ross said simply. "The FBI is moving forward with federal charges. My office is pursuing state charges for fraud, conspiracy, and filing false reports. And you're going to help us prove that Karen Whitfield is a predator who's been terrorizing this community for years." Sarah thought about the families in the photographs. about the Hendersons who'd been too afraid to fight back, about all the people who'd lost their homes because they didn't have 12 alpaca guardians to protect them. "What do you need me to do?" Ross smiled. "What you've been doing. Document everything, stand your ground, and let your alpacas do what they do best, which is protect their family." That evening, Sarah stood in her pasture, watching her alpacas graze in the golden light of sunset. Tomorrow would bring new attacks, new complaints, new attempts to drive her away. Karen would throw everything she had at Sarah, using every legal trick and bureaucratic weapon in her arsenal. But Sarah was no longer fighting alone. She had the law on her side, the media watching, and the FBI building a case that would end Karen's reign of terror forever. Most importantly, she had 12 faithful guardians who'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what the world needs. As if sensing her thoughts, Spartacus lifted his head and looked at her with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to say, "We've got this." Sarah smiled and scratched behind his ears. "Yes, we do." The final battle was coming, and Sarah Martinez was ready to end this war once and for all. 3 weeks later, the courthouse in downtown Austin buzzed with an energy that reminded Sarah of a championship boxing match. Media vans lined the street, reporters jockeyed for position, and curious onlookers crowded the steps, all waiting for what the Austin American-Statesman had dubbed the trial of the century's most unlikely heroes. Sarah sat in the front row of the packed courtroom, flanked by Sheriff Bradley and District Attorney Ross. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversations of her neighbors, the clicking of cameras, and the scratch of reporters' pens. But her attention was focused on the defendant's table, where Karen Whitfield sat in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the defeat in her posture. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of revelations that had shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise spanning 5 counties, involving forced property acquisitions worth over $30 million. Karen hadn't just been a neighborhood bully, she'd been the operational head of a sophisticated fraud ring that had destroyed dozens of families and communities. But it was the testimony of her victims that had truly sealed Karen's fate. "Your Honor," Prosecutor James Mitchell addressed Federal Judge Maria Hernandez, the government calls Sarah Martinez to the stand. Sarah's legs felt unsteady as she walked to the witness box, but she kept her head high. In the gallery, she spotted Maria Santos from Channel 6 News, who gave her an encouraging nod. The story of the Alpaca Guardians had gone viral, sparking a national conversation about rural bullying and property rights that had reached all the way to Congress. "Ms. Martinez," Mitchell began, "can you tell the court how this ordeal began?" Sarah took a breath and began her story. She described the escalating harassment, the destroyed fence, the hired intimidators, and Karen's systematic campaign to drive her from her home. But it was when she talked about her alpacas that the courtroom fell completely silent. "These animals didn't just protect my property," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They protected my right to exist in my own community. They stood between me and someone who wanted to erase everything I'd built." Objection. Karen's lawyer, Richard Kellerman, jumped to his feet. "Relevance, Your Honor." Judge Hernandez looked at him with barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Kellerman, given that your client hired criminals to intimidate witnesses, I think the court is very interested in how those witnesses protected themselves." Overruled. Mitchell continued. "Ms. Martinez, in your opinion, what would have happened if your alpacas hadn't intervened?" Sarah looked directly at Karen, who was staring at her hands. "I would have been just another victim, another family driven from their home. Another win for a system that rewards bullies and punishes people who just want to live in peace." When Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, she felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She'd told her truth, honored her alpaca's courage, and spoken for every victim who'd been silenced by Karen's tactics. But the real drama was yet to come. "Your Honor," District Attorney Ross announced, "the state calls Karen Whitfield to the stand." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Karen rose slowly from the defendant's table. Gone was the confident, entitled woman who'd terrorized Sarah's neighborhood. In her place was someone who looked genuinely afraid for the first time in her life. "Ms. Whitfield," Ross began, "over the past 5 years, how many families have you personally driven from their homes?" I don't understand the question. Let me rephrase. How many false complaints have you filed with government agencies? Karen's lawyer objected, but Judge Hernandez overruled him again. I was protecting my community, Karen said weakly, by hiring criminals to intimidate your neighbors. Navarros walked to the evidence table and picked up a recording device. Your Honor, I'd like to play Exhibit 47B, a recorded phone conversation between the defendant and David Cross, made while Mr. Cross was on Ms. Martinez's property. Karen's face went white as her own voice filled the courtroom. I don't care. What it takes, make her understand that she doesn't belong here. The recording continued for several minutes, each exchange more damning than the last. Karen's instructions to Cross were clear, specific, and completely illegal. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent, except for the quiet sobbing coming from the defendant's table. Ms. Whitfield, Ross continued relentlessly, did you or did you not orchestrate a criminal conspiracy to deprive Ms. Martinez of her civil rights? Karen looked up with tears streaming down her face, and for a moment, Sarah almost felt sorry. For her, almost, I just wanted her to leave, Karen whispered, because she didn't belong in your community. Because ... Karen's voice broke. Because she was everything I used to be. The courtroom held its collective breath. What do you mean by that? Ross asked gently. She was brave. She was starting over. She was building something beautiful from nothing. Karen's voice was barely audible. I used to be like that, before I became this. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. In that moment, she saw not a monster, but a broken person who'd lost herself somewhere along the way and had tried to destroy in others what she could no longer find in herself. But sympathy didn't erase the damage Karen had done to dozens of families, the lives she'd ruined, the dreams she'd crushed. Judge Hernandez's verdict was swift and decisive. Karen Whitfield was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, extortion, and civil rights violations. Her assets were frozen pending restitution payments to her victims. The real estate development company was dissolved, and several of her associates faced their own federal charges. But perhaps most importantly, new legislation was fast-tracked. Through the state legislature, dubbed the Alpaca Protection Act by the media, that strengthened penalties for using the legal system to harass property owners and created new protections for rural landowners against predatory acquisition tactics. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her pasture watching her alpacas graze in the morning sun. The fence had been rebuilt stronger than before, and new alpacas had joined the herd. Princess had given birth to twins, and Spartacus had assumed the role of protective uncle with typical alpaca dignity. The Double Creek Ranch had become something of a tourist destination. Families drove from across the state to meet the guardian alpacas and hear their story. Sarah had started offering tours and educational programs, turning her small farm into a thriving business that celebrated both the animals she loved and the community that had rallied around her. But the best part was the peace. No more looking over her shoulder, no more fearing every approaching car, no more wondering if today would be the day she'd lose everything. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Mrs. Chen. Sarah, dear, you need to turn on the news. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the news app. The headline made her laugh out loud. Former property fraud kingpin Karen Whitfield denied parole. Alpaca is still more popular than I am, she tells reporters. The accompanying photo showed Karen in prison stripes, looking defeated and somehow smaller than Sarah remembered. The article quoted her as saying she spent her time in prison thinking about the families she'd hurt and wondering if she'd ever find a way to make amends. Sarah closed the app and looked at her alpacas. Spartacus lifted his head and gave her a look that seemed to say, "Job well done." "Yes," Seba said aloud, scratching behind his ears. "Job well done." The war was over. Justice had been served, and the most unlikely heroes in Texas had proven that sometimes the gentlest souls make the fiercest guardians. As the sun climbed higher over the Double Creek Ranch, Sarah Martinez smiled and got back to the business of living her dream protected, as always, by 12 faithful friends who'd shown the world that courage comes in all shapes and sizes, even woolly ones. The end?